Like many other places, Britain is gripped by an energy crisis, and some people are very clear about what's to blame.
There will be millions of pensioners this year who cannot afford to turn on their gas or their electricity or their lights because people living in wonderful big homes where I live in Winchester can afford to do so, but they're promoting this net green zero policies.
Yes, everyone acknowledges Vladimir Putin has something to do with it, but they say it doesn't stop there. For example, Lord Frost, expected to be highly influential in the next UK government, our energy policy has been criminally negligent. The choice by net zero proponents to rely on renewables and interconnectors and to run down storage means that we face blackouts, hideous business crushing costs, and people shivering and dying in the cold. And Tim Newark, political commentator for The Express, had little doubt. Government departments pressed ahead with reducing our gas storage capacity to meet increasingly unrealistic green targets. And even worse, we have allowed green campaigners to intimidate the government into reducing our ability to produce our own energy, by which he meant the 2019 moratorium on fracking. In addition, he referenced green levies that make up 25% of electricity bills. The Telegraph ran an editorial reinforcing the fracking point. By most estimates, Britain has considerable shale gas reserves. One trade body calculates that if only 10% were tapped, it would make the UK self-sufficient in natural gas for 50 years. In a monumentally short-sighted move, however, ministers effectively banned companies from exploiting it, too terrified of the Green lobby to do something that was so obviously within the national interest. Various people have pushed back against those claims with equal certainty. In other words, it's yet another one of these polarised issues. What you decide is responsible for the energy crisis is kind of whatever you were against already before the energy crisis. Environmental campaigners say it's all the fault of overdependence on fossil fuels. Climate skeptics say it's all the fault of too much investment in renewables and running down fossil fuels. So while there's plenty of scope for debate about what you should do about the situation, what can we learn about the truth of why we're in this mess to begin with? Specifically, is it true that net zero madness is to blame for spiking energy prices? Well, without fear nor favour, let's have a look. There are a number of specific claims. One, that a major factor in the current rise in energy bills is the increase in renewables. Two, that because of net zero climate policies, the UK government closed down its natural gas storage capacity. Three, that fracking was abandoned in the UK because of the same net zero madness, and if it hadn't been, it would have lowered energy costs. Four, that the green levy is 25% of people's electricity bills. And then there's a broader claim that it probably pays to treat separately, which is that the move towards net zero policies will generally mean more expensive energy, which is a different, longer timescale claim than the one that says it's implicated in the recent and ongoing energy spike. That one is a more complex question with more variables than the others. Don't expect the answer to that to be so black and white. But let's start with the smaller ones first. In fact, let's deal with claims 2, 3 and 4 first, because they are all component parts of the first claim. In other words, that three of the ways that net zero policies pushed up the price is by retiring gas storage capacity in the country, shutting down fracking and adding a huge amount to bills as a green levy. The main closing of gas storage that took place that people make reference to was the so-called Rough gas storage site, owned and operated by the company Centrica. This was shut down in 2017, but there was quite a bit that was going on in the years running up to that point. Why was it closed? Centrica said that it simply did not make financial sense to keep it open. So the economics of gas storage had previously worked like this. You bought gas during the summer when the price was at its cheapest. You stored it, then you sold it in the winter when the prices were at their highest. And in so doing, arguably also served a valuable strategic function on behalf of the nation. Except during the 2010s, that wasn't how it seemed. For one thing, gas was reliably cheap, relatively easily obtained on the global market. That reportedly led a number of people, particularly government ministers and energy company bosses, to assume it would just stay that way. The problem was that the consistently cheap price, largely thanks to the rise in liquefied natural gas, meant that the economics of buying in the summer no longer had enough of a price advantage to make it as profitable as it had been. So companies like Centrica approached the government and asked if they wanted to put money into keeping those reserves going. That was in 2013. Now remember, at that point, Russia was one of the G7 countries. The 2015 invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea hadn't yet happened. That led the government to decide not to subsidise storage. This was in spite of several reports being commissioned that warned of the strategic exposure, such as Project Discovery in October 2009, which drew attention to the fact that, having become dependent on oil and gas since the discovery of both in the North Sea, it had now reached the point where those local supplies were becoming exhausted. In 2004, the UK had become a net importer. And this was a key shift in the country's energy security reality, but it hadn't been accompanied by a shift in its practice. And in 2010, when Labour lost the election and was replaced by a coalition of Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, the government was ironically seeing upward pressure on energy bills and didn't want to subsidise gas storage in the name of reducing bills in the short term. Officials said that resilience through diversity would be enough to deliver energy security. In other words, the combination of supply sources from North Sea pipelines, from Norway, from LNG, liquid natural gas around the world, plus a push into renewables, and also it looked like fracking was going to be taking off. All of those things would combine to keep the lights on. When they announced there would be no support, gradually various storage sites began to close down. To get some sense of how exposed this left Britain, you only have to look at this graph, showing the gas storage capacity that it has compared to other European countries today. So it was decisions in 2013 focused on cost that set the stage. By the time Centrica decided to close Rough in 2017, the facility was ageing and losing hundreds of millions of pounds. It needed serious investment for refurbishment, but that wasn't going to be supported, and the government did nothing to discourage the company from closing it. A Conservative Energy Minister at the time, Claire Perry, said in a letter to the Labour Party that government support for Rough would have undermined investment in other infrastructure, such as LNG sites and smaller storage facilities, and risked making the market dependent on government support. Nothing note about climate targets. At that point, it was generally held that the move to coal to natural gas delivered emissions reductions, which was entirely compatible with the idea that you would manage your strategically important gas storage facilities, if not expand them. But that's not what they did. Still, the geopolitics was very different then. Nobody could have known, right? Well, not so fast. Some people are paid to look ahead and try to anticipate such things. And so they did. In 2017, a report was commissioned of a firm called Cambridge Economic Policy Associates to work out what would happen if, say, Russia's pipeline gas to Europe was disrupted. Good question. In retrospect, it came back with a series of concerns, warned about the complexities that would come in that situation that would be impossible to fully anticipate. But it was framed in such a way that the then Business Department Minister Greg Clark felt able to decide that the existing strategy was still just fine. Incidentally, the week this video was shot, we got the news that Centrica's Rough facility is to reopen, albeit with only a quarter of its previous maximum capacity. Okay, so that's one claim. The storage was closed because of net zero policies. Not true. What about fracking? Well, there's no doubt that the environmental campaigners have always hated fracking with a passion. Although that doesn't mean that a sensible net zero policy would necessarily have to agree with them. In its technical report, the UK's Committee on Climate Change showed that there would be an ongoing role for natural gas in the UK's energy over the coming decades. I mean, there would have to be. So the question of where that gas comes from is entirely separate to the question of how much is needed. Now, of course, the environmental campaigners would never accept that. So the question is, how much did they influence the government's policy in relation to fracking? The first thing that's worth noting is that it's hard to even understand how much of a contribution shale gas would actually make. Again, because most of the people putting figures out there are devout campaigners on one side or the other. You have to be somewhat wary of taking anything on trust, and you just have to try to look more deeply at the source data. So supporters of shale gas say that there is enough gas under the ground to make the UK self-sufficient in gas for 50 years, which assumes current rate of consumption, in other words, no net zero at all. So, for instance, that claim was specifically made by Francis Egan, the Chief Executive Officer of would-be fracking company Quadrilla, in a letter to the Daily Telegraph. Now, he doesn't support it in that letter with any studies at all. So what evidence does exist? Well, there's a peer-reviewed paper from 2019 by Whitelaw et al. That concludes it would be significantly less. Potentially economically recoverable reserves of less than 10 years of current UK gas consumption. Well, that still sounds like it would be worth having, if other problems didn't prevent it. I mean, that's a debate for another day, really. People have strong views, pro and anti-fracking, both sides. It's not really the question we want to answer here. The question is, why didn't it happen? The opposition parties certainly opposed fracking on the grounds of climate change, but the government didn't share that view. Indeed, it spelled out on its policy in relation to fracking, the Independent Committee on Climate Change recognises natural gas has a role to play as we meet our 2050 net zero emissions target and includes demand for it in all scenarios to achieve this. But it ground to a halt over the concerns over seismic tremors caused by the early fracking trials. So the government specified this: if a seismic event of or above magnitude 0.5 on the Richter scale is detected, the operator will pause injection operations. Well, on 26th of August in 2019, there was such a seismic event. That blew through that limit, hitting 2.9 on the Richter scale. The government said, while seismicity was at a level below that at which we would expect significant damage, seismic activity at this level does impact local communities and was clearly unacceptable. In addition, an interim report by the Oil and Gas Authority suggested that it is not currently possible to accurately predict the magnitude of earthquakes caused by fracking. So, on the 2nd of November 2019, it announced that it would take a presumption against issuing any further hydraulic fracturing consents, a moratorium that was taken to be a de facto ban. So you may have strong views about whether that was the right thing to do or not, even the right reason to do it or not, but the claim that it was done so because of net zero policies, obviously not true. Now, it could have been true. If the Conservatives had been voted out of office, the replacement government would almost certainly have committed to ending fracking for more green ideological reasons than quoting climate change. It's just not what happened. Okay, next claim, 25% of energy bills made up by the green levy. Well, this is short because all you can do is say that's not true under current prices. Under summer 2022 price cap, green levies made up less than 5% of energy bills, roughly £95 per year, which pays for subsidies for older renewable energy projects. There's another 3% of bills, £57 per household, that goes towards social measures, the Warm Homes discount to help poorer pensioners with their bills, and the energy company obligation, which pays for insulating the homes of people in fuel poverty. The thing is, that contribution is expected to stay the same, unless the new Prime Minister removes it entirely, which involves moving it onto general taxation. But if that doesn't happen, then when bills go up, the percentage that those levies represent will become even smaller, because the wholesale prices went up, but not the levy. So again, whatever you think of the idea of the levies in the first place, whether you think they should be there or not, people have strongly varying opinions. As always, the claim that it's as much as 25% of the cost does not turn out to be true. So, what about the other arguments about the rising energy costs? Some have argued this: ministers have forced 11 cheap and reliable coal-fired power stations to close since 2015. High energy bills and fuel poverty have been engineered as part of the net zero agenda. We'll ignore for now the fact that nobody was talking about net zero in those earlier years and just accept it as a catch-all label for climate policy generally. But that version of history doesn't turn out to be true either. Two things drove the closure of the old coal-fired power stations. One was that natural gas was seen as the cleaner but just as essentially cheaper, flexible fuel. Secondly, and specifically, the EU's Large Combustion Plant Directive, which specified that plants that weren't fitted with flue gas desulfurization should be closed after a set number of operating days and by 2015 at the latest. That directive was focused on reducing air pollution, but from sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides, not CO2 emissions. Some plants fitted desulfurization equipment, and they were able to keep going. Those 11 power stations were too close to the end of their life for that to be deemed economic, so they opted out. Again, there is no doubt that coal-fired power stations should be closed on the basis of net zero, but to argue that this was why those ones were closed just isn't historically true. So the question is this: is there anything in the recent crisis that can be laid at the door of climate policy? And whatever the answer to that, is it true to suggest, as some of the environmentalists do, that on the other hand, a transition in the future will mean everything will be cheaper and there is no big cost to be paid? Those are two very different questions. So the analysts at the International Energy Agency have been very clear about the drivers for the current crisis. And it's been exacerbated by Russia and Ukraine, but it wasn't started by Russia and Ukraine. Post-pandemic, there was a rapid recovery in demand for energy, which exceeded the supply. It wasn't able to ramp up as quickly. And this was exacerbated by a particularly cold and long winter season in Europe, with more cold spells in the first quarter of 2021 in North America and East Asia, which was then immediately followed by heat waves, all of which added to the rapid upward trend in gas demand, particularly in Asia. That higher demand was hampered by a number of outages and problems in the supply chain. There was one climate-related issue thrown into all of that mix, which is that in Europe there was an extended period of extremely calm weather, leading to considerable underperformance of wind-generated power. And then, yes, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's when everything goes off the charts. Russia begins to reduce the flow of gas, and even just a little squeezing makes an already bad situation a whole lot worse. What made it strike so hard and fast was the fact that many European countries, including the UK, had moved from the old practice of signing long-term contracts to buying all of their gas on current prices. It's a practice that saves money if prices stay low. Not so great in retrospect, though, from the surging gas price that we have today. The IEA stated that it could not see support for the contention that this had been made worse by climate-focused energy transition policies. Indeed, some have suggested that earlier backsliding on climate policies by the UK government had made things actually worse than they otherwise would have been. So Prime Minister David Cameron had famously declared that he would get rid of all the green crap, and that had resulted in rolling back a number of policies. The website Carbon Brief calculated that had that not been done, it would have saved £168 per household in October, £220 in January. The savings would have come from additional renewable capacity, a higher number of homes insulated to high efficiency standards, and new homes that would have been built to zero carbon standards. Now that is intuitively likely to be the case. But there is a real case to argue when it comes to looking at future costs. So no, the people talking about net zero madness being to blame for the bills being high today, by all appearances, they are being opportunistic, they are not reliable narrators. But then some on the environmentalist side are arguing that renewable energy is just so wonderful and so cheap. Really, all you need to look is at the price differentials of fossil fuels and renewables made all the stark today by the price of gas, and you'll realise we need as many of them renewables as possible. That is not an argument without problems either. And the thing is, as this article points out, wind and solar are only so cheap during the early stages of transition. During those early stages, there's a large base of fossil fuel, nuclear and other generation. So fitting in those intermittent sources of energy, solar and wind, you can do it relatively easily. But the higher the percentage of the grid comes from those sources, the more costly it becomes to deal with the added issues of intermittency. At that stage, you need to create a whole storage infrastructure that at day one doesn't exist. You add increasing elements of risk given the potential for long periods of low energy supply from those sources when the wind's not blowing. Mitigating that risk also brings costs, so you probably shouldn't believe anyone who promises you a new golden age of risk-free, low-cost energy on either side. The environmentalists who extol the virtues of renewables are downplaying the costs involved if their penetration into the grid is as high as they argue for. The anti-environmentalists on the other side will happily champion nuclear power, which is a high-quality, energy-dense power source. It's a good power source, but it's also not cheap. People who argue that renewables are more expensive seem happily to ignore the cost of nuclear. The fact is that these two sides, arguing for unbalanced solutions and taking chunks out of each other along the way, they're not serving us tremendously well. The UK Committee on Climate Change envisaged an energy mix that was strongly diversified between nuclear, between renewables, hydrogen, as well as some natural gas with carbon capture. The point is that every energy source has pros and cons. You use a mix sufficient to balance those out against each other sufficiently to create energy security. The overwhelming theme you get when you revise the history is that we've hit bad times because successive governments failed to invest. They failed to prioritise energy security long term versus avoiding controversy and cost in the short term. A process that those pushing back against climate change today are seeking to continue and replicate, as indeed are those pushing back against every new proposal for nuclear power stations, for example. The point is that all of the technologies that would move us away from fossil fuels have one thing in common. They'll be relatively cheap to operate, but before you get there, you have to do some really relatively expensive investment. It's very expensive to build the nuclear power station, but then it's very stable and relatively cheap after that, until you have to decommission it at the end, of course. It's expensive to build all the infrastructure to support renewables. Once it's done, there's no ongoing fuel costs. It becomes relatively cheap. So in the same way the Victorians had to build an enormous sewerage system, something that we now take for granted almost as a free good. So we will not get to an energy future without the significant cost of investment. That is what the environmentalists will happily gloss over, particularly at this point, while everyone's feeling highly sensitive to price. And it's exactly why politicians have put off difficult decisions for so long. As the UK Prime Minister, still just about, Boris Johnson, said in the foreword to the government's recent energy security strategy, talking about how the UK had shaped its energy mix on the local bounty that it got from the North Sea. He said this: as the years passed, we drifted into dependence on foreign sources. Sometimes this was through deliberate planning. More often, it was the byproduct of policy fudges, decision dodging, and short-term thinking. Yes, indeed. There's a saying that politicians know full well how to do the right thing. They just can't figure out how to do the right thing and then get re-elected again afterwards. And that brought us to the point where there is no choice but to invest for the future. We've already put it off too long. Now, unfortunately, the choices between what sort of investment are being fought out between contrasting ideologies rather than a pragmatic engineering mindset. So no, ideology did not create today's crisis. It might just create tomorrow's, though, unless we can find a better way to have this discussion. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, What are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.